Everyone, welcome to Old News, where the fossils are old but discoveries are new. My name is Laura Beth. I will be your host, and I'll be keeping an eye on our chat in case you have any questions or comments, or if you win Old News Bingo, you can let us know. If you didn't print out your bingo sheets, you can use the link in the chat to find Old News Bingo. And before we get started, I do want to let y'all know that we have both automatic captions available by clicking the CC button on top of the video, or you can view our transcriber captions at the Typewell link, the reader link that we put in the chat. And I know a lot of you are students, or maybe you know students who are interested in paleontology, maybe specifically paleo art. And so I did want to let you know that we have some virtual programs that are meant for homeschool or track out students that are focused on paleo art. And actually, they are taught by our coworker who made our lovely Old News anatomy guide, Alexander Luke. So there's a link to find out more and register for those programs in the description of the video. So check that out if you're interested. And with that, I think I'm ready to introduce our expert, Dr. Christian Kammerer, the museum's research curator of paleontology. Hey, Christian.
Hello, Laura Beth. Good to see you today.
It's good to see you too. We've got a very mysterious, vague description for today's discovery.
Oh yeah, well, it has been an exciting month for paleontology. As most are, there's always new things coming out, always new discoveries being made. But I thought that this one was particularly cool, and there's an especially nice fossil involved. So this is actually coming to us. Let me pull it up here. This is a paper that came out just a couple weeks ago in the journal Current Biology. So this is a Mesozoic reptile, which I know many of our viewers are fans of, but it's not the dinosaur. It's not New Dinosaur, unfortunately. Rather, it's these flying reptiles, the pterosaurs, which are sort of an equally iconic group in the Mesozoic. Pterosaurs, so they're sometimes called pterodactyls. These were flying reptiles that are related to dinosaurs, although they're not dinosaurs themselves, that first appear in the late Triassic and survive up until the end of the Cretaceous at the extinction that wipes out a lot of life at that time. So these are some of the classic depictions of pterosaurs, and kind of intentionally out of date a bit to try to establish what do people think about pterodactyls. At the right, that art there by Burian showing them as very bat-like creatures kind of hanging by their feet. And nowadays we don't think that that's the case. Think that these animals were probably on the ground in rookeries, or when they were in trees, sort of grasping the side of the limbs, not hanging like bats. They are superficially bat-like in some ways, in that their wings were flaps of skin rather than feathers. But unlike bats, which have all the fingers together as sort of a big web, the pterosaur's wing was based almost entirely on the pinky finger, that long wing finger that they have there, and then the rest of the arm. You can see on the left this one pterosaur maybe being chased off of its branch by an early bird, Archaeopteryx. So they're not birds either. They did coexist with early birds, but they didn't have feathers. They did have sort of a fuzzy covering that may be the same as some of the proto feathers in dinosaurs, although that's still pretty hotly debated among pterosaur workers. But we know they had some kind of fuzz on them, probably for helping to keep them warm. And this is something that you see in a lot of the more recent art of pterosaurs. So there's a life-size scale model on the left there of the largest known pterosaur, and indeed the largest flying animal that we're aware of all time. Is an animal called Quetzalcoatlus that lived in the late Cretaceous of southern North America. The material that's been known is mostly from the Big Bend region in Texas. So this is an animal that may have had up to a 40-foot wingspan, so size of a small aircraft. And you can see it has kind of that fuzzy covering there. And so I think a lot of like talking about people's preconceptions of pterosaurs is giant size often comes up, because these were things like Quetzalcoatlus and even smaller but still huge species like Pteranodon on the right there are thought of as these giants of the air. And indeed, they include creatures larger than any currently a living flying animal, and bigger than any bat or bird or insect that has ever existed. Even the biggest extinct birds, sort of max out at around 20-foot wingspan. Nothing getting into the zone of Quetzalcoatlus and its other near relatives, the Asdarchids, which were the last and largest of the pterosaurs. But pterosaurs, they weren't all giants. There are itty bitty ones too, like Anuregnathus here. This is one of the really small bodied, almost sort of like sparrow sized pterosaurs. You can see it hunting a bug there, which really would have been no bigger than a cockroach. So this is actually a group that we've talked about on Old News before, because this one of these Anuregnathids, Cynomacrops, was featured in an earlier episode. So really tiny pterosaurs as well as the giants. And of course, pterosaurs are descended from very small-bodied animals, like this animal, Kunguniphon, that I described, and we also mentioned on the show before, which is a really small creature called a lagurpatid that lived in Triassic of Madagascar and could have fit into the palm of your hand. And basically, all of the early pterosaurs are quite small, and seem to have been ancestrally quite small-bodied creatures. So this is, paleontologists looking at patterns in the fossil record have tended to treat pterosaurs as an example of sort of increasing, body size through time over their evolutionary history. When you think about all the really big pterosaurs, things like Quetzalcoatlus and Pteranodon and their allies, these are all Cretaceous animals. Now, there are a few smaller Cretaceous ones as well, like the Tapejara on number 5 there. But all of the really small ones, tend to be Jurassic or Triassic. And so these are the earlier and often the more primitive pterosaurs, including the group called Rhamphorhynchoids. These are the ones that have the long tail with that kind of like leaf-shaped vein on the tip of the tail. So Rhamphorhynchoids, that term isn't used as much nowadays as it used to be. It used to be pterosaurs were split into Rhamphorhynchoids and pterodactyloids. Recent work has shown that the Rhamphorhynchoids are a grade. They're just like a group leading up to the later ones, to the pterodactyloids. So they're not a natural group. But for the most part, they're considered to be very, very small animals. Until at least, this most recent discovery that we'll be talking about this week. So this is from the Middle Jurassic, really smack dab in the middle of the Mesozoic era. And it's coming from somewhere that maybe like we don't think about too often as sort of a hot spot of, paleontological discovery, which is Scotland. So in the north of the British Isles, and specifically the Isle of Skye, which is part of a group of islands called the Hebrides off the northwestern coast of Scotland in the Atlantic Ocean. So Skye, it's a geologically complex island. It has rocks of many different ages. So the Jurassic ones that a lot of the research has been done are in the northeastern part of the island. And the fossil we'll be talking about today was in a little peninsula called Brothers Point that I have labeled there. Skye is really, beautiful, natural wonderland, absolutely gorgeous landscapes there, incredible geology. So you can see like the strata exposed here. This is at the Old Man of Stoer, which is a rock formation not far actually from where the new fossil was found along the coastline of eastern Skye. It can be a beautiful place to work. I have had the pleasure of spending time there and going to fossil sites there. And when the sky is clear, it is very nice. Most of the time, though, I'd say it looks more like this just kind of like miserable rain and fog everywhere, and can be very hard to collect fossils in. And so it is, there hasn't been, historically, there wasn't a huge amount of research effort in fossil prospecting in the Mesozoic beds of Skye. But thanks to work by, local fossil hunters, and then in the past 10 years or so, dedicated field teams from various British universities, a lot of, really incredible fossils have been found that are hugely expanding our understanding of these Middle Jurassic creatures, particularly at smaller body sizes than full gigantic dinosaur. So the one we're talking about today was discovered by a graduate student, Amelia Penny, coming from the University of Edinburgh in 2017. Apparently the collection of the fossil was very difficult, so all of these rocks are exposed basically on the shoreline at low tide. So you can see, where there's this scale bar here, this little ruler. That's right next to where the fossil was as exposed. And you can see it's covered in water and even has a tide pool in there with like little limpets and snails around. So this is underwater a lot of the time. And so when you find a beach fossil like this, you're really fighting against the tide to get it out in time. And from what I hear, it was quite a struggle going against the rising seas and sort of like battering waves in order to rock saw what ended up being quite a large specimen out of there. But thank goodness they did, because what it turned out to be was, the most complete pterosaur fossil found in the British Isles in maybe 100 years. There are some well-known pterosaurs like Dimorphodon that are known from really, really nice material in England, but it's been a long drought for sort of quality pterosaur material from the UK. So they gave it the name Jark Skierchnach, which is a Scottish Gallic origin, so means basically winged reptile. The species name also references the Gallic name of the Isle of Skye. And so the specimen of Jark, so this is the only known skeleton of this animal, but really most of it is there. So missing, some of the tail, some of the wings, and the sort of the surface of the skull, because that was what was exposed and had been eroded out already by wave action. But really, most of the rest of it is there. Really, amazing fossil. And so here is some art showing what it may have looked like when it was alive. Sort of typical Rhamphorhynchoid morphology here. So this is art by actually the lead researcher on this study, Natalia Jagielska, from the University of Edinburgh, is a graduate student working on pterosaurs there. And was also able to, study, really the fine details of anatomy of this thing. So, using CT scanning, which, has become part of the standard toolkit for paleontologists to look at sort of the detailed structure, the morphology of the skull in this thing, and even get, parts of the internal anatomy, things like the brain size and rough shape that's shown in the bottom there. Comparing it to some of the other pterosaurs for which brains are known. And it has sort of like a kind of primitive brain, more like other early pterosaurs in the Triassic and Jurassic than the later Cretaceous ones, which may have been doing somewhat, maybe slightly more complex in terms of their flight capability. They lose the long tail and, have some changes to the morphology of their arms and wings, indicating they may have been doing maybe more bird-like styles of flight. But, Jark is, still pretty standard Rhamphorhynchoid, with the exception being its size. So the really exciting thing about this discovery, just other than, wow, nice new fossil, is that this is the largest of any of the Jurassic pterosaurs known. And it shows that the Rhamphorhynchoids actually were also able to achieve quite large sizes. So this is not anywhere in the range of, Quetzalcoatlus. This is not airplane size. But the authors do estimate Jark as having a wingspan possibly exceeding, 3 meters. So that's in the 10-foot range, which is a pretty sizable flying thing. Like when you think about the biggest condors and albatrosses today, they're a little short of that. So I mean, that would already be bigger than sort of the biggest eagles. So I think that'd be a very impressive animal. And it's a little uncertain because the length of the wing finger is, it's not fully preserved in this, and it's partially dependent on what other animals you're using to reconstruct it. So if Rhamphorhynchus is sort of the closest relative in this family tree that they put together. So using that as a comparison, you get one. You can get one thing. If you use another one like Scaphognathus or Dorygnathus, these are just related pterosaurs, you might get a slightly different one, maybe slightly less. But regardless, it's a big and would have been an impressive creature. So this is showing us that the sort of the gradual increase in body size through history in pterosaurs, it was not totally linear. It wasn't just like start small and then through time as they evolve just get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. There were cases where body size got smaller, like those are neurognathids, because actually you can see that's this group here that I'm highlighting. So those are closer to the Cretaceous ones that are giant than to these other rhamphorhynchoids. So there must have been a shrinking event here in neurognathid origins. And then there were some independent evolutions of large body size, like in Jark and some of its closest allies. So really, it's not super surprising because pterosaurs, they were so diverse. But just being able to have confirmation that you are seeing all of these different, sizes and shapes and probably ecologies showing up really throughout their evolution. And we're probably only capturing a small fraction of that just because they are, animals with very delicate bones that are very difficult to preserve. So we're really only getting pterosaurs in very particular environments, mostly sort of near shore aquatic environments. So there could have been all sorts of crazy pterosaurs out there that we really, have no fossil record of because they're just not, they weren't living in this places where, the correct type of preservation was.
Yeah. So this is really exciting, and I just want to, we've got a few questions already in the chat,
Okay.
but I would like to point out two comments made one after the other by two different people in our chat.
Uh-huh.
So Anne says that it looks like a puffin with teeth, and Soda Cola says that looks creepy.
Oh, I think they're, well, pterosaurs, I guess, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. I think
Yeah.
I think they would have had a lot of character to them. Some certainly cuter than others. Like I think the neurognathids would have been, quite adorable little things. Just like little pterosaur. They've got big eyes. They've got kind of like big smiling mouth. You just like put on your hand. The larger ones, they do get a bit fangly. Like Jarks definitely has a lot of those big interlocking teeth. And that is something that we are less accustomed to seeing nowadays. So there are a lot of extinct animals that have that style of teeth, and it's something that is thought to be an adaptation for eating fish. So essentially it's like a fish trap of just being able to like sort of spear them in between those masses of teeth. So you see that in plesiosaurs, the marine reptiles, and which are also, thought to have been mostly fish eaters, or squid, or any like little swimming thing that you want a lot of really needle-like teeth to trap. Whereas the animals today that are doing things similar in terms of their ecology are mostly seabirds, and so they're toothless. So they have slightly different approaches. Be they something like pelican, which is just like gulping whole, or things like terns that are kind of like spearing them with the beak. So different approaches to really the same goal. But if you are a toothy creature like reptiles, we saw time and time again through convergent evolution, the fish eaters tend to get these like super interlocking fang situations going on. You see that actually in some fossil crocodiles as well. And to an even greater degree than like the living ones, which are really sort of the only survivors of reptilian groups that have something of that type.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so good job, Anne, for guessing that that's what the teeth were used for catching fish. Yeah. And Soda Cola also made a comment. It would be funny if pterodactyls were actually our everyday birds, but evolved. So we know that birds these days are evolved from dinosaurs, a
Mhm.
particular dinosaur group, but pterosaurs are not dinosaurs, right?
That's right. So pterosaurs, the origin of pterosaurs is still somewhat mysterious because we don't have a good intermediate form between pterosaurs and whatever their ancestors were. Like for birds, like Archaeopteryx has been known since the 1860s, and even though it took until the discovery of the feathered dinosaurs in northeastern China in the 1990s to really just like lock it in that, oh yeah, for sure, birds are evolved from dinosaurs. I mean, that idea has been out there since the 1800s, that birds are modern dinosaur descendants. With pterosaurs, like we don't have, and the other thing about like Archaeopteryx is like it's when you look at it, it's very obviously like both a bird and a dinosaur. Like it has a long tail, it has teeth, it has claws, it has all like kind of the dinosaur stuff, but then also it has feathers and it has a breastbone and all of these like bird features. With pterosaurs, there isn't like a intermediate pterosaur. So recent work, including by myself and my colleagues, have argued that there's that this group, the Lagorpetids, of which Kangounophon is one, are the closest relatives of pterosaurs, but they aren't like they're weird in their own ways, and in many ways they're not like a perfect ancestor for pterosaurs. Among other things, like the Lagorpetids seem to have been they're very ground-based animals. They were probably fast runners or maybe even hoppers, kind of like a little kangaroo rat based on the leg morphology. They have super long spindly legs, and we know relatively little about their arms, but it doesn't seem like the arms were longer than the legs, which is what you expect in a pterosaur, because if they've got wings, arms are longer than the legs. We don't have anything that looks like it was like a gliding pterosaur either. Like the earliest ones were already seem to have been capable of powered flight. We have a very similar problem in studying bat evolution. So there isn't a good proto-bat known either. Like the first bats are straight up bats. Like you can tell they're primitive compared to modern bats in that they still have a claw on the tip of some of the wing fingers, for instance, which is lost in modern bats. And then they couldn't echolocate yet. So they like the skull has some primitive features there. But if you looked at it flying around, you'd say, oh yeah, that's just a bat. You wouldn't be like, oh, what is this weird antediluvian monster? It would be pretty clear that it's a bat. Mm-hmm. So the fossil record has not been forthcoming. And the reasons for that probably have a lot to do with what I noted at the end of sort of the slides there, which is that we would expect these animals to be evolving probably in close canopy forests. So probably are arboreal tree-dwelling animals that are crawling up into the trees and then gliding from branch to branch. And that's sort of how their wings are getting a start before they become fully flight capable. And that's it's a very bad place to preserve fossils, especially if it's in like a tropical forest, which tends to have acidic soil and doesn't really preserve fossils at all. So there's probably a lengthy part of the evolutionary histories of both of these groups that the record of, the fossil record is against us, and it's going to take, really exceptional luck of finding, one that just happened to fall into a river at the right point, trying to jump from tree to tree to get fossilized, and then for us to find it, which is, million to one shot. I think eventually they will be discovered. Like people are very actively working on these problems and looking in rocks of the right age where they could be found. But it's going to take a lot of luck in order to actually discover them.
Right. So speaking of fossil discoveries, mm-hmm. when you were describing how this team found this fossil and then, extracted it, I guess.
Yeah.
I was in my head imagining this team as like a fossil rescue team. They're just like racing against time to try to like get the rock saw, get it out of there, don't destroy the skull. And I don't know, I was just wondering, do you have any experiences like that?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Generally it is I have not had to really race against the tide to get a specimen out. Although I did, some of the work I've done There was on riverbank exposures where the fossils were about to fall into the river and would have been lost forever there.
It's like
So
a
that was
fast-flowing river that would just carry them away.
not even just a very deep river, where if these were on like ledges, almost like cliffs overhanging the river, where if it fell in there, it's not coming out.
Wow.
And so those were kind of like rescue operations. But really, like, it depends on how much of an erosional regime, so how much erosion is going on at the site. There are places on Earth where, you can have a fossil that's sort of poking out and you could come back 50 years later and it would still be there and it's just fine. If the rock is very hard and, there isn't like a ton of rain, for instance, or heavy winds, it's probably going to be okay. And then there are places where, if there is like a lot of water going over it, or sort of sandstorms, it could erode out the fossil even just year to year, maybe even just month to month. So sometimes like it needs to be like done out and jacketed that field season, or else it's going to be lost. So like a lot of times also, in kind of intermediate zones where you want it to be out, but it's not totally necessary to get it out, what we'll do is we'll rebury it at the end of a field season. So you don't want bone exposed on the surface. If it is, if you've started excavating it and can't get it out all in one field season, maybe because it's just like gigantic, like for dinosaurs, generally we will bury the bones and then come back to it the next year to finish up. That also can help, because we don't want, fossil poachers out there who could see exposed bone and, try to steal the remains.
Mm-hmm. Does that happen pretty frequently where you have to bury it again? I imagine that's sort of like disheartening to have like worked on it for, like on and off for like 2 or 3 months, however a field season lasts. And then it's like, okay, well, we couldn't get it out completely, so we just have to rebury it.
Yeah, it's a bummer.
Okay.
You want generally to be coming back from the field with the fossils, and sort of always do. Like I haven't been on any digs that it was just like, well, that's it, we were leaving it there, because you're not also, most digs are not like focused on collecting one specimen, because you're also collecting fossils in the area and prospecting, and even in areas where like if you find one sauropod, you're finding other things around there. Mm-hmm. But yeah, if the goal is to collect one specimen and you don't manage to do it in the field season, I mean, yeah, it's dispiriting. It's usually expected. Like there's a limit to how much can be done. Like there's specimens that I'm working on that I've been out there working on them for years now, and I really wish that they were in the lab. But we only have so much time, and it is what it is.
Yeah. Time and people to,
Yep. The person power and equipment, and in some cases, heavy equipment is needed, like excavation tools, bulldozers, helicopters, even to get things out of there. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you need to, like, the other thing is if you collect it and then you can't actually get it out, what was the point? Like if you leave, because you're not going to leave a plaster jacket just like on a hillside. Mm-hmm. Like you need to get it out of there. So
that would get destroyed in the rain, right?
Yeah. Or if you're in a mountainous region, you could just like slide down the side. Been in some situations where that was a concern. But yeah, if you don't have sort of the proper transport for it, you're better to leave it in the ground until you do.
Mm-hmm. So Megan had another question about just the paleontology field experience. So first off, how long is the field season? And then does that just depend on the location and the funding available? Yeah,
it's it can be, I do a lot of field work that's day trips that, just go out in the morning, come back at night if it's close by. But then, in the paleontology unit at our museum, my colleague Lindsay Zano does, sort of like 3-month trips a lot of times in the summer. And most folks are not out for the full 3 months. We'd like to like switch it up. and you can have people who are out for maybe like a month of that, and then swap out with other members of the crew. But I've been in field trips that are definitely like multiple months long, and if you're going to places, really exotic locales like the field work that's done in Antarctica, like you need to count on minimally like 6 weeks there because it's just such a hassle to get the funding, get the logistical support, and then just the amount of time for getting down there, getting trained to deal with, freezing temperatures and everything. So yeah, I mean, fossil hunting can just be an afternoon, or it can be a multi-month affair. It really just depends on the situation.
Okay, and going back to, we have a quick dinosaur question before we get back to pterosaurs. Soda Cola wanted to know, why is Colorado the state with the most dinosaurs? And I have not heard that, so I don't know if that is true, but I definitely think about the Western US as having a lot of them.
So Rocky Mountains in general, I would not say Colorado in particular. I think actually Utah probably, if you were to give the crown to one, has the most species of dinosaurs there. But in terms of like, number of fossils produced, like Colorado, Utah, Montana are all very high up there. Part of that has to do with what age rocks are exposed in what places. Like, for example, places in the Northeast have very few Mesozoic rocks exposed there and very limited exposures where they are. Whereas in the Rockies, Mesozoic rock is exposed basically everywhere, and it is a lot, for miles and miles around. The other thing is just being in mountains. So, fossils, as I say this often, but like there's no shortcut to finding fossils other than looking at the ground. So, you have to be able to see them exposed in order to collect them. And so if you've got bare rock, like in mountains or in the desert, those are good fossil hunting areas. If it's like in a forest or like a grassland, it's not great. So like most of the US is, lush and green, or has, is urbanized and covered with asphalt. And so you're not going to find fossils easily in those places. There certainly are fossils to be found outside of the Rockies. But it's not like, you go to a place like Utah and Colorado and you can just like walk out section all day and find fossils all along the way there. So it's not, I won't say it's like easy work, because, hiking up a mountainside and then hauling hundreds of pounds of rock down isn't easy, but it's much easier to find fossils exposed than just about anywhere else in our country, at least.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, thank you for answering those questions. I'm going to take it back to pterosaurs, but let us know in the chat if you think of any other questions. Okay, so Christian. These pictures of pterosaurs, the old paleo art and the new paleo art, the pterosaurs always seem to have this huge head. Like in some cases, it's, over half the size of their body. And so, like, how do they not just fall over from their head just being so long?
It's a good question, because it is ridiculous in some of them. And I can pull up just like Quetzalcoatlus again, because it's not just, I mean, yes, they have very big heads, but also like many of them have these elaborate crests as well, so adding to the size and presumably the weight of the skull. I think how they were able to deal with this and like not just have their heads weigh them down, in part, the bone itself is very light. So if you look at, there are birds today that have very large skulls in relation to their body as well. Things like toucans and hornbeaks, that have giant beaks. Like toucan beak also can sort of be half the size of the body. And they are, if you actually ever cut open, if you're dissecting a toucan and look through the beak, it is just full of air pockets. Like it's really almost like styrofoam in there. And so the pterosaurs, they also had very lightened bones compared to most animals, bird-like in that regard. And so even though the head is big, it's not quite as heavy as you think it is. And even the crest, the crest would have been fairly light. With that said, anything, even light bones, that is going to help weigh down the animal. But in like the Asdarchids, for instance, which have sort of the biggest heads, they have these really, in some cases, quite robust neck vertebrae, which suggests that they had pretty sizable muscles at the back of the skull to help support the head, and may also have been like using it. It's been argued that these Asdarchids were predators on animals that were crawling around, like they would have been almost heron-like, and spearing some of the small animals, maybe even like small dinosaurs living around them. So, some of the musculature could also have been helping, to propel the skull down for potential killing blows. But yeah, I think some of it was also just supporting the skull.
Wow. And so those crests that are on the top of their head, are those for, well, do we know what those are for? Do we think they might have been for, communicating with each other?
Yeah, so it's difficult to say. It has been argued that in at least some of them, it could have been for display, like males showing off to attract mates. The most work has been done in Pteranodon because it has, well, one, in the Lagerstätten, where the preservation is super good and we have soft tissue from the fossils. We found that like a lot of pterosaurs do not have bony crests, but they have soft tissue crests. So they have some kind of just like skin flap up there, and that generally isn't fossilized. And so unless you have the really excellent preservation. But Pteranodon has a bony crest, and Pteranodon also is a fairly common pterosaur. So in the Kansas chalk, which is, excuse me, Lake Cretaceous, in Central North America, in Kansas mostly, but also in sort of Nebraska and Oklahoma, there's a lot of Pteranodon fossils. And so statistical work has been done looking at crest size. And it seems that, there's some evidence of dimorphism, which is that, there are basically two sizes in the population, which could represent males and females. So, that's just one example, though. Like so many of them had crests, they could have been doing totally different things. The crests are also very different in size and shape. Some of them, it's truly ridiculous. There's one called Nyctosaurus, which is sort of a distant relative of Pteranodon that also is from the chalk, that the crest is almost like, as big as the rest of the body. It's just like wild. It's like this kind of like giant Y-shaped prong coming off the back of the head. I don't have an image on hand, but you need to look it up. Nyctosaurus, Nyctosaurus. Really just a wild looking creature. And it's, some of these things scientists have argued that they were like used as a rudder, like help steering while it's in flight. And that seems unlikely to me based on what I know about sort of, biomechanics. I think display probably is the usual answer there, but there's a lot of diversity, and it's difficult to be sure of everything.
I've never seen Nyctosaurus, but I'm imagining like a typical pterosaur, but with an antenna, or like a big bulky antenna on its head.
it kind of looks like that.
Wow.
Yeah, and then there's some other ones that have kind of almost look like a boat sail on the back of the head. There's one called Tupandactylus from Brazil that also has just like a wildly huge crest. So yeah, a lot of crazy diversity in the group.
And we have another question from the chat. Did the Quetzalcoatlus walk and run?
So whether pterosaurs were bipedal or quadrupedal is something that has been debated by paleontologists for a long time. I think the evidence is now pretty squarely on the side of them being quadrupedal. So they would have been sort of crawling around, or at least, sort of walking. I don't want you to think that they're just like dragging their bodies against the ground, but they would have been using the tip, sort of the wrists of their wings folded over, walking around like that. So they probably would not have been getting up on their hind limbs and running. Which is also, as I was saying before, with their probable closest relatives, the Lagurpitids, is a big shift because those were actively running and maybe even hopping things that were hind limb propelled, whereas pterosaurs are mostly forelimb propelled in the air and then would have been, walking on all four limbs on the ground or in the trees. But yeah, probably not bipedal running in any of these ones.
And is that true just for the really large ones, or for
No, we think that's true of all of them.
the
There's no evidence in even the smaller ones, Rhamphorhynchoids and their allies, of bipedal action. And indeed, there is for those ones, there are trace fossils, what are called ichnites, fossilized footprints, that have been referred to pterosaurs that do seem to show alternation between the hand claws and the foot claws, suggesting that it was, sort of wing, foot, as they were crawling around on both hands and feet.
Huh. Wow. Yeah, I have never heard of footprint fossils like from this type of prehistoric creature. Only
Yeah.
That's really, really cool. All right, everyone. So this will be our last question. But Christian, I was just curious about the wing shape, because the pictures that you shared, from your slides, it seemed like we saw a lot of diversity in the wing shape. The Cynomacrops, that one to me had like very butterfly kind of looking wings. And I don't know, I'm just wondering, I feel like the membrane on their wings would probably not fossilize, right? So how do we know what the wing shape was? Or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they did fossilize.
So it does. We do have some fossils of the wing membrane, or the patagium, as it is known. They are rare. They're only in these, exceptional Lagerstädt situations. So the ones that are best known are from the Zollenhofen locality in Germany, like the famous Vienna pterodactylus is a really well-known one. And it seems to show what is called the deep chord wing structure, which basically means a very extensive wing membrane that extended from basically the tip of the wing finger down to the ankles, so that they would have really had a quite broad membrane that would have incorporated both the arm, the side of the body, the legs, and even the base of the tail. So there's also a wing membrane sort of between the legs and then onto the tail called the uropatagium, basically just the tail patagium. There's been quite heated debate among paleontologists as to whether that morphology, which is known in only the few species for which we have preserved membranes, was true for all pterosaurs. So particularly for the later Cretaceous ones, which they lack, a long tail and are clearly doing something maybe more complex in terms of their flight capability, more bird-like in some ways. Whether they may have had a narrower wing membrane, sort of the narrow chord, as it's called. But it's all very speculative. Right now, as far as we know, pterosaurs would have mostly seemed to have had, pretty extensive, more bat-like wing membranes, but we really can't say. It's like we just need more fossils and better soft tissue preservation to be able to really gauge the variability in that.
Right. Yeah. Well, Christian, thank you so much for sharing everything about this really cool topic of pterosaurs. It's something that I don't know a whole lot about, so I really appreciated it.
Oh, my
And
pleasure.
thank you, everyone, for sharing your questions with us. Lots of great questions today.
Yeah, like that.
Yeah, made me think. Join us next month, April 12th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Go ahead and mark your calendars. And if you'd like to sign up to receive reminder emails and the printable old news bingo sheets, you can register at the link in the description. And it is Reptile and Amphibian Month, so we were very on theme today, Christian. At the museum, Reptile and Amphibian Month. So we've got lots of different virtual and in-person programs going on, and there's a link in the video description where you can find out about those and register if you're interested. And if you're interested in the paleo art program, don't forget to click that link in the description. So thank you again, everyone, and I hope you have a great day.
Yeah. Stay safe out there, everybody.
Bye.